I considered myself a German with a Jewish religion or Israeli religion. Going back to my parents and grandparents, they were born in Germany, they lived in Germany in different towns. My dad served in the German army, was German. The fact that the Nazis then defined Jewish religion as a race, that really wouldn't alter that. And then I left the country. I was able to leave it unharmed. I came back as a soldier. I managed to go through the whole war. And I hated the Germans, and I hated everything really connected with it. I took some pictures at Buchenwald. We were able to get into Buchenwald before the Germans and before the guards had a chance to kill everybody in the camp. I knew that my parents and grandparents were in that camp. I doubted very much that they were in Buchenwald. The question still arose whether they survived, whether they were still living. The war ended, and I was ready to go home to the United States. And I just all of a sudden found myself in Nuremberg as an interpreter to the prison psychiatrist. And that really made a very big consolation. It could not bring back my parents. It could not bring back any relatives. It could not bring back any life that I have lost. But it certainly was satisfaction to have these people and monsters in a prison cell in front of me, where I was the victor and they were the vanquished.
This is my father. He was born in 1923 in Munich. His given name was Hans-Heinz Triest. He changed it when he arrived in America to separate himself from the past. But in many ways, my father's German identity remains intact.
We are showing a film which I took in 1947. And I happen to have about the same figure that I have now. I did have a little more hair, and as you can see, I produced it, I directed it, and I filmed it. I used the camera, which I managed to buy very expensively with a couple packs of cigarettes. And I believe it was one of the first documentary films, at least by a member of the occupation forces. And I was back there in 1947, the city of Munich, especially the inner core of the city, and also many of the outskirts, was about 90% destroyed.
Munich had been home to the Triests for many generations.
The building on the right is our apartment house.
My father returned to the city for a year after his duties at the Nuremberg Trial. Those who had ruined the life he had known now lived in ruin.
When you're there to do what you think is right, it's nice to see that what you have done was complete.
A sense that justice has been done is redemptive to my father. Nazism destroyed the hope that anyone could be both German and Jewish.
This is the Hauptbahnhof. That's the main railroad station. Now that is
My father denied Nazism this surrender
on one side of
by
the-
reclaiming his story from its wreckage.
These pictures reveal the arrogance with which the German warlords meet the charges of criminal injustice to civilized people. Prosecutor Robert Jackson of the United States opens the trial with a strong indictment of the defendants.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish.
The room was bigger than today. Today
There are still echoes in room 600 at the Nuremberg Superior Court,
Civilization cannot tolerate
where Chief Justice Ewald Beerschmidt informs my father and me about its history.
when the Allies planned to organize,
My brother Glenn is also here.
they decided
Glenn is a professional still photographer,
6 weeks or
continuing my father's interest in film.
And when the judgment day came in Nuremberg on 1st of October 46, each of the defendants came out of that door.
Hermann Wilhelm Göring.
There are 21 left in the dock to face civilization's accusation.
From indictment to verdict, the Nuremberg Tribunal lasted 1 year. Allied prosecutors presented a comprehensive case that remains the most extensive record of Nazi atrocities and war crimes. With other top Nazi leaders already dead, the 21 defendants came before the court, the personification of Nazi evil, all intent on diminishing their roles.
Ob ich mich schuldig oder nicht schuldig bekenne.
Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated heir and chief of the Air Force.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig.
Göring was the first to plea. The other 20 defendants would follow his lead
to make the
of
plan
disavowal.
for a complete solution of the Jewish question. Nein, so ist das nicht.
In his testimony, Göring asserted that neither he nor Hitler knew of the plan to exterminate Jews.
Soweit es mich betrifft,
I already have said that not even approximately did I know to what degree this thing took place.
nicht schuldig.
Julius Streicher, publisher of the widely read anti-Semitic paper Der Stürmer, that advocated violent persecution.
I don't believe that those who had been given the order by the Führer to carry out the killings or to pass an order to kill, that those people would have been made to do this by my periodical.
Ich bekenne mich nicht schuldig.
Wilhelm Keitel, head of the military.
You remember the basic idea of the order, that human life costs absolutely nothing? You signed this order with this statement?
Ja.
Alfred Jodl, Hitler's most trusted military advisor.
Was ich getan habe oder tun musste, kann ich reinen Gewissens vor Gott, vor der Geschichte und vor meinem Volke verantworten.
Hans Frank, ruler of occupied Poland, where the Nazis liquidated Jewish ghettos and where Auschwitz is located. Like the others, Frank denied knowledge of atrocities, but was one of the few to express remorse.
Gegen das Judentum jahrelang geführt und wir haben uns in Äußerungen ergangen und mein Tagebuch ist mir selbst als Zeuge gegenübergetreten. 1000 Jahre werden vergehen, um diese Schuld von Deutschland nicht wegzunehmen.
Conclusion. Frank was a willing and knowing participant in a program involving the murder of at least 3 million Jews. The tribunal finds that Frank is guilty under count
I have to admit that I'm unfortunately old enough to have been here in 1945 and 46. And I spent 6 to 8 hours a day, primarily not in the courtroom, but in the prison.
My father is speaking to a tour group visiting the historic courtroom.
We would interview the defendants and try to figure out what made people do the things they actually did. Occasionally, I would sit in the gallery or visitors gallery, which was above where you're sitting now. And I remember there was an elevator to the downstairs and then a long walk over to the prison.
In 1945, there were 4 prison buildings at Nuremberg. Only one of the original buildings remains, and it too is scheduled to be torn down. For my father, this is a final opportunity to visit a place where so many memories abide.
I had a prison pass that was good 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we would use our time when court was in session interviewing witnesses, and the witnesses were kept in the upper tiers, main defendants being down here. I remember Goering being on the left side, pretty much at the end of the line, which may have signified that he is the head of all these people, but Goering, and then followed by the military men like Jodl and Keitel, the admirals, Raeder and Dönitz, and then an assortment of others, from Ribbentrop to Frank and Rosenberg and Seyss-Inquart. We had Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, was one of the witnesses in the upper tiers. So was Himmler's wife and his daughter Gudrun on the lower level on this side. I remember we were standing here just about at the place where Stryker's cell was. I remember one incident that a little short lieutenant, I think she was Jewish. Stryker certainly thought she was Jewish, because according to Stryker's criteria, she looked Jewish. But she would come down here. She hated Stryker's guts, and she would take a little string and tie a little cutout paper doll and dangle the string in front of Stryker's window, signifying that he would soon be hanging. That was one of, and then Stryker would get extremely upset and would even occasionally disrobe and show his rear end to her and make all kinds of gestures. I mean, it would just absolutely enrage him.
Is the door the same? Is everything the same in terms of...
The door, I think the doors were really identical. The little flap on the door was kept open, and they had guards at every door because after Lai committed suicide, when he only had 2 or 3 guards walking around, they would assign a guard to every single door on the lower level where the defendants were, and they had a light with a metal shade that was placed over that so they could see the whole room. And the bed was mounted to the wall. It was kind of a steel bed, but the tables, unlike this table, they had a very thin top that could not be used to push up against the window and stand on it. It would not have supported it. And they did have a chair. So one of us would sit on a chair, and the psychiatrist would sometimes sit on a chair, and sometimes he would sit on the bed right next to the prisoner. and sometimes I would sit next to the prisoner.
My father worked with 3 doctors assigned to gather psychological data about the prisoners. Psychologist Gustav Gilbert spoke German and collected most of his information about the defendants himself. Gilbert later wrote a book about his interviews. Psychiatrist Douglas Kelly also wrote a book, though he left the trial early. 12 years later, Kelly killed himself in a manner eerily similar to Goering. At the Nuremberg prison, Kelly was replaced by psychiatrist Leon Goldenson, who relied on my father for translation and other matters with the prisoners. Some of Goldenson's notes were collected into a book published in 2004. In the Nuremberg interviews, my father's role as translator is cited many times.
I came in many times alone, first of all, to get information for the psychiatrist. And I came in on my own because I had questions that I had for the prisoners, and I was very fortunate. I was not limited to go into the cell with someone else. The guard was standing outside. The door was shut behind us, and then it was reopened when we were ready to go out.
My father was locked inside with perpetrators of evil, who represented the sins of a nation that he once loved. He was 22 years old, standing at a decisive crossroad in history.
These crimes with which we deal are unprecedented. First, because of the shocking number of victims.
The momentous question facing the world and my father were related. How could any reconciliation with Germany be considered in the wake of such monumental crimes and nationwide complicity?
The Nazi movement was an integrated force in every city and county and hamlet. The Nazi despotism, therefore, did not consist of these individual defendants alone.
At Nuremberg, the Allies decided to vest responsibility in the Nazi leadership, though guilt was everywhere in the populace.
Incited the youth. 1,000 Sokols worked slaves. 1,000 strikers and Rosenbergs stirred up hate. 1,000 Franks tortured and killed. 1,000 spears and punks administered. The party power.
For 1 year, the Allies projected a show of justice, though the scope of the crimes seemed to nullify all notions of justice.
For the extermination program which took the lives of 5 million Jews.
But if a relationship with Germany were to be rebuilt, some sense of justice would have to be served in the eyes of the world and my father.
After I talked to them, they were the prisoners. I was able to walk out the door, and the door locked behind me. So that was a tremendously gratifying feeling to have these people here. And it was also a feeling that made me later on reconcile my feelings with Germans or Germany as such, because I felt that I was part of the force that punished these people, that did away with the evil that had done so much harm to me and my family. We're now sitting in a jail cell, and we're waiting for the verdict. On the end, you can see Stryker and Goering. Now, this is a position that Stryker struck many times, that defiant arms at the side. He even did this in Nuremberg. It's funny because you look at these pictures and you think back to where you were or how you were or what you were in 1936. And then 10 years later, exactly in 1946, you were standing with your arms on the side, and they were prisoners behind bars and were just about to be hung.
Nuremberg made possible my father's reconciliation with his Germanness. Nuremberg, like most major German cities, was reduced to rubble by Allied bombing.
And you could see from here practically over to the park.
The city was notorious for its mass Nazi rallies, extolling racial hatred. It was also notorious for the Nuremberg laws.
German citizens are only those of German or related blood, willing to serve the German Reich and people. Marriages between Jews...
Goering proclaimed the Nuremberg laws in 1935. They deprived German Jews of their civil rights, property, and ultimately their very recognition as human beings. Amid Nuremberg's devastation, the large prison and palace of justice were still intact. For these reasons, both practical and symbolic, Nuremberg was chosen as the site for the war crimes trial.
Goering was still as pompous as he always was. Stryker was still as adamant in his beliefs as he always was. He was probably the foremost Jew hater and Jew baiter in Germany. But I had gone into Stryker to get some information, and when I walked in, he said, "You know, I can smell a Jew from a mile away. I can tell them by their looks, by the way they walk, by their behind, by their body, by their hair, and I know that you are a pure Aryan and your people must have come from a Nordic country." It proved how wrong Stryker was, because looking at Stryker, he did really not have the pure Aryan look himself, compared to the pictures that the National Socialists drew of what is Aryan. Stryker was probably the opposite. But Stryker went to the gallows, giving the Hitler salute, and was defiant to the very end.
In the prison cells of the Nazi leaders, my father always kept his composure, regardless of what they said. He concealed his outrage even when he met with Rudolf Hess, a witness for the prosecution. Hess was the commandant of Auschwitz.
You stand in front of a man that murdered your parents, and what can you do? I personally would have liked to do the same thing to all these guys that they did to so many millions of innocent people. I would have loved to throw them into a concentration camp and slowly kill them the way they did with so many other people. But we weren't here to do that. We were here to get information, to relay that information to the proper authorities, and to interview the prisoners, and that we did.
The overall goal of the psychological study was to see what kind of person could commit such evil. Whether any insight was gained is unclear, and my father believes not. With rare exception, the prisoners disclaimed responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi regime. There were no dark, deep-seated motives for their misdeeds. They followed orders in mental lockstep.
Any one of the defendants, if I remember, had the feeling that the only reason they're on trial is because they lost the war and we were the victors and they were the vanquished. I don't think any one of them sat there and said, well, we did terrible things and therefore we're in front of the tribunal and we deserve to be punished.
The wheels of justice grinding slowly on seem to bore big stuff.
They may be larger than life as far as history is concerned.
The entire Hitler dynasty is charted so that the blame can be squarely placed on the guilty man.
But they certainly did not offer a picture of any superiority. They were just plain ordinary people, and some were a pitiful looking group.
Could it be a slight case of rope burn, Mr. Goering?
Hermann Goering was very heavily into drugs, that we slowly had to wean him off. Although Goering was very actively involved in the whole Nazi program of exterminating Jews. Goering denied any major guilt. He felt what he did was perfectly all right. He was also, as far as being interviewed, he was very congenial. He was very easy to talk to. He liked to be talked to because he liked to be in the limelight. Stryker and I actually had more conversations. He was a cruddy personality, really. Ribbentrop was kind of a shaky and yellow looking, and he was certainly not the arrogant foreign minister of the Third Reich that he had been for so many years. Rudolf Höss,
Commandant of Auschwitz.
Commandant of Auschwitz, he didn't have any characteristics that were really outstanding. We walked into his cell to interview him, and the first thing he did was complain because we had taken his shoelaces away, and he had socks, and he told us that his feet were cold and he would appreciate if he could get his shoes back.
Wann war das?
Das war
Hess did not grasp the irony of his complaints, even as he testified about the death camp he ran.
was Verpflegung, Unterbringung.
His demeanor on the stand was that of bureaucratic matter-of-factness.
Wie in jedem anderen Gefängnis
An affidavit he wrote was read into the record at Nuremberg.
I commanded Auschwitz until 1 December 43 and estimate that at least 2,500,000 victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 succumbed to starvation and disease. Those who were fit for work were sent into the camp. Others were sent immediately to the extermination plant. Children of tender years were invariably exterminated, since by reason of their youth they were unable to work. Still another improvement.
Like other prisoners at Nuremberg, Hess divorced conscience and duty, and even claimed such division to be part of the German character.
It took from 3 to 15 minutes to kill the people in the death chamber, depending upon climatic conditions. We knew when the people were dead because their screaming stopped. After the bodies were removed, our special commandos extracted the gold from the teeth of the corpses. Included among the executed and burnt were approximately 20...
He was actually very proud. He was very proud that he not only obeyed orders, but that he met his quota and actually did better than his quota. He was very proud of the fact that he accomplished what he was supposed to do and accomplished even more. Just looking at him, you couldn't tell that the man is evil. And yet, knowing his history or talking to him, you could pretty soon find out that he was evil. So sometimes you can sit in front of a man who can be a mass murderer, and he doesn't look any different than another fellow that sits next to him and has never done a bad thing in his life.
Hess was tried and executed at Auschwitz 6 months after the Nuremberg verdict. Of the 21 defendants at Nuremberg, 18 were found guilty. 7 received prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 11 were sentenced to death. Goering committed suicide by cyanide 2 hours before his scheduled execution. The other 10 men were hanged. Their ashes were disposed in a secret location.
I didn't personally see them hang, but I saw pictures afterwards, and I was very glad that at least we had eliminated some of the people from this world. But in my estimation, really not enough of them.
It is still hard for me to imagine how my father could be face to face with these men and suppress his indignation, so close to such evil, in such banal guise.
You know, they always tried to blame it on someone, and the most convenient people to blame it on were those that no longer lived. Hitler was number one. It was all Hitler's fault. He gave the orders. And then Himmler was number two, because he no longer lived. He had committed suicide. Just like Hearst told me, I received the orders, I carried them out, I did the best I could. And it was the same with the other defendants. Hitler gave the orders, and it's very easy to blame someone that can't deny it. But then later on, I happened to work in denazification in Munich. It was very difficult to find anyone that had ever been a Nazi. It was just like no one in this country was a Nazi. And then you wondered who ran the country and who did it.
The collective disavowal expressed by the Nazi leadership seemed to characterize an entire nation. Even in Munich, the Nazi past seemed already buried in the rubble of the city and German psyche. Working in denazification, my father was approached by many German civilians seeking his influence. They would bring letters and photos trying to show that they once had Jewish acquaintances. Those who knew his family said condolences, whereas once they had turned their backs.